Every woman knows the fear of being replaced by someone younger. At 54, Lady Caroline thought she had finally found love, only to watch her betrothed choose a girl half her age at their own wedding feast. But in the shadows of Castle Ravencrest stood someone who saw her worth. Lord Luka was an ancient vampire prince who had waited centuries for the right moment. When Caroline's husband-to-be cast her aside in front of the entire court, Luka stepped forward and claimed her as his eternal bride. This isn't just a story about second chances. This is about how the most powerful creature in the realm chose a woman the world had forgotten. But why did he wait 300 years to make his move? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient stones of Castle Ravencrest had witnessed 3 centuries of weddings, but none quite like the one Lady Caroline had imagined would be hers. She stood before the towering mirror in her chamber, adjusting the deep burgundy velvet of her wedding gown for what felt like the 100th time. The fabric, rich and elegant, had been chosen to complement her auburn hair, now touched with silver threads that caught the candlelight like precious metal. At 54, Caroline knew she was no longer the fresh-faced beauty she had been in her youth, but she had hoped foolishly, perhaps, that Lord Edmund saw something in her that transcended mere appearance. The Ravencrest family portrait hung above her mantelpiece, a constant reminder of the legacy she carried. Her parents, Lord Thomas and Lady Evangeline, gazed down from the ornate frame with the dignified bearing that had defined their noble lineage for generations. They had died when Caroline was barely 25, leaving her to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics with little more than her wit and the modest inheritance that came with the Ravencrest name. Her first marriage to Lord William had been arranged, but it had grown into something resembling affection before his unexpected death 19 years ago had left her alone once more. Those 19 years had been filled with the quiet dignity of managing William's estate, caring for tenants who respected her fairness, and slowly building a reputation as a woman of substance rather than mere beauty. She had thought those qualities would matter to Edmund. She had been wrong. Helena, her loyal maid who had served the Ravencrest family since Caroline's childhood, bustled about the chamber with the efficiency born of decades of devotion. The older woman's weathered hands smoothed invisible wrinkles from Caroline's gown, her grey eyes holding a mixture of pride and concern that only someone who truly knew her mistress could possess. "You look radiant, my lady," Helena murmured, though her voice carried an undertone of worry that Caroline pretended not to notice. "Lord Edmund would be a fool not to see your worth." Caroline smiled sadly at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was handsome, certainly, with intelligent green eyes and a bearing that spoke of breeding and character. But she was not 22, as Lady Isabel was. She was not the daughter of a powerful lord with armies at his command, as Lady Isabel was. She was simply Caroline, a woman whose value had apparently diminished with each passing year in the eyes of those who mattered. The sound of revelry drifted up from the great hall below, where the wedding feast was already beginning. Lords and ladies from across the kingdom had gathered to witness what should have been her moment of triumph, a second chance at happiness after so many years of solitude. Instead, whispers had reached her ears throughout the week. Whispers about political alliances and strategic marriages. Whispers about Edmund's growing interest in forming ties with Lord Blackwood's vast northern territories. Whispers about Blackwood's beautiful young daughter. Caroline had tried to dismiss the gossip as the cruel entertainment of bored courtiers, but the knot of anxiety in her stomach had grown tighter with each passing day. Edmund's visits to her chambers had become less frequent, their conversations more stilted. When she had mentioned the wedding preparations, his responses had been evasive, his attention elsewhere. Still, she had clung to hope. Still, she had believed that their months of courtship, their shared conversations about literature and philosophy, their quiet walks through the castle gardens, had meant something real. The great hall of Castle Ravencrest was a masterpiece of medieval architecture, its vaulted ceilings adorned with intricate stonework that seemed to dance in the flickering light of hundreds of candles. Tapestries depicting the heroic deeds of Caroline's ancestors lined the walls, their rich colors muted by age, but still magnificent. The long tables, arranged in a horseshoe pattern around the raised dais where the bride and groom would sit, groaned under the weight of the finest foods the castle kitchens could provide. As Caroline made her way down the stone staircase, her hand trailing along the worn banister that had been polished smooth by countless generations of Ravencrest hands, she felt the weight of history pressing down upon her. This castle had been her sanctuary, her heritage, her home. Tonight, she had hoped it would become something more, a place where she could finally build the family she had always dreamed of having. The noise from the great hall grew louder as she approached, the sound of laughter and conversation mixing with the melodic strains of the court musicians. She paused just outside the massive oak doors, gathering her courage and smoothing her skirts one final time. Through the gap between the doors, she could see the assembled guests already seated at their tables, goblets raised in toasts, faces flushed with wine and merriment. Lord Edmund stood at the head table, resplendent in his deep blue doublet, his dark hair perfectly groomed, his handsome features animated as he spoke with the guests around him. At 38, he was considered quite the catch wealthy, titled, and possessed of the kind of easy charm that made him popular at court. Caroline had been flattered when he had begun paying attention to her, surprised that a man of his standing would look past her age to see the woman beneath. Beside Edmund, looking every inch the perfect bride, sat Lady Isabel Blackwood, 22 years old, with hair like spun gold and skin that seemed to glow with youth and vitality. She was everything Caroline had once been and could never be again. The sight of her sitting in what should have been Caroline's place sent a chill through the older woman's heart. Caroline's hands began to tremble as the reality of the situation crystallized before her eyes. This was not her wedding feast. This was her humiliation, orchestrated by the man she had dared to love and witnessed by everyone who mattered in their social circle. The golden goblet that sat before Edmund, the very cup from which she had imagined drinking the ceremonial wedding toast, now rested in front of Isabel's delicate hands. Helena appeared at Caroline's side, her face pale with shock and anger. "My lady," she whispered urgently, "we should return to your chambers. You need not endure this public shame." But Caroline found herself unable to move, transfixed by the scene before her, like a rabbit caught in a hunter's snare. Edmund raised his goblet high, and the hall gradually fell silent as all eyes turned toward him. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the vast space, each word falling like a stone into the stillness. "My friends," Edmund began, his tone jovial and confident, "tonight we celebrate not just a union between two hearts, but an alliance that will strengthen our realm for generations to come." His gaze found Caroline's across the crowded hall, and for a moment something that might have been regret flickered in his eyes. "Lady Isabel has done me the honor of accepting my proposal of marriage, and Lord Blackwood has graciously agreed to our union." The hall erupted in cheers and applause, but Caroline heard none of it. The blood rushed from her face, leaving her feeling dizzy and hollow. The man she had trusted with her heart, the man to whom she had opened her carefully guarded emotions, had not even had the courtesy to tell her privately that their engagement was ended. Instead, he had chosen to announce his new betrothal at what was supposed to be their wedding feast, using her own home as the stage for her public disgrace. As the celebration continued around her, Caroline became aware of other eyes upon her, curious, pitying, some even delighting in her downfall. The courtiers who had smiled and bowed to her just hours before now whispered behind their fans and goblets, their expressions ranging from false sympathy to barely concealed satisfaction. She had always known that court society could be cruel, but she had not expected to become its latest entertainment. The castle that had been her refuge now felt like a prison. The walls that had sheltered her family for generations now seemed to close in around her, trapping her in this moment of ultimate humiliation. Every face that turned toward her felt like another cut, every whispered comment another wound to her already shattered dignity. In that moment of absolute despair, as Caroline stood frozen in the doorway of her own great hall, watching her dreams crumble to dust, she became aware of a presence in the shadows near the great fireplace. Someone was watching her with an intensity that cut through her shock like a blade through silk. She turned her head slightly, following the sensation, and caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the alcove between two massive stone pillars. Even from across the crowded hall, she could see that this was no ordinary guest. Tall and imposing, dressed in black that seemed to absorb the flickering candlelight, the stranger possessed an otherworldly stillness that set him apart from the revelry around him. When their eyes met, Caroline felt a jolt of recognition that made no logical sense. She had never seen this man before, yet something deep within her soul seemed to know him. The stranger's gaze held neither pity nor amusement, but something else entirely, a deep understanding, perhaps even approval, as if he alone among all the assembled guests saw her true worth. As if he had been waiting for this precise moment, this exact combination of circumstances, to reveal himself. Caroline blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs, and when she looked again, the figure had vanished into the shadows as silently as he had appeared. But the sensation of being watched, of being seen and valued by someone who understood her pain, lingered long after the mysterious stranger had disappeared from view. Caroline could endure no more. The sound of laughter and celebration from the great hall followed her as she fled through the castle's winding corridors, her burgundy gown rustling against the stone walls like autumn leaves in a bitter wind. Tears she had fought to contain now flowed freely down her cheeks, each drop a testament to dreams shattered and dignity destroyed. The weight of 3 centuries of Ravencrest pride seemed to crush down upon her shoulders as she stumbled toward the only sanctuary she could think of, the castle gardens, where she had walked so many evenings with Edmund, believing his sweet words and gentle touches meant something real. The heavy oak door leading to the gardens groaned on its ancient hinges as Caroline pushed through into the cool night air. The sudden silence was almost deafening after the cacophony of the feast, broken only by the gentle whisper of wind through the carefully tended hedges and the distant sound of water trickling from the ornate fountain at the garden's heart. Moonlight filtered through the canopy of ancient oak trees, casting dancing shadows across the gravel paths she knew as well as the lines of her own palm. Caroline collapsed onto the marble bench beside the fountain, her composure finally crumbling completely. The sobs that racked her body came from a place deeper than mere embarrassment. They rose from the well of loneliness that had defined so much of her life, from the quiet desperation of a woman who had dared to hope that her value extended beyond her youth and beauty. Edmund's betrayal was more than the loss of a husband. It was confirmation of every cruel whisper she had ever heard about aging women, every pitying glance, every suggestion that her time for love and happiness had passed. 54 years old, she whispered to the darkness, her voice breaking on each word. 19 years alone, and still foolish enough to believe in fairy tales. The bloodstone pendant at her throat, a family heirloom passed down through generations of Ravencrest. Women felt suddenly warm against her skin. She had worn it tonight thinking it would bring her luck, that the deep red stone would symbolize the passion she hoped to find in marriage. Now it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, growing warmer with each beat of her broken heart. "You are far from foolish, Lady Caroline." The voice emerged from the shadows between the oak trees like silk over steel, cultured and refined, yet carrying an undertone of something ancient and dangerous. Caroline's head snapped up, her tear-stained face turning toward the sound, expecting to see one of Edmund's guests who had followed her into the garden to witness more of her humiliation. Instead, she found herself looking at the mysterious figure she had glimpsed in the great hall. He stepped from the darkness as if he had been part of the shadows themselves, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of nature. In the moonlight, his features were sharp and aristocratic, his skin pale as marble, his dark hair swept back from a face that belonged in the portraits of long-dead kings. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, crimson as fresh blood, ancient as the stones of her castle, and filled with an intelligence that spoke of centuries rather than mere decades. Caroline should have been afraid. Every instinct should have screamed at her to flee from this stranger who appeared from nowhere with eyes like fire. Instead, she felt an odd sense of calm settle over her, as if his presence answered some question her soul had been asking without her knowledge. "Who are you?" she whispered, making no move to rise from the bench or call for help. "I am Lord Luka," he replied, stepping closer with that same impossible grace. "And I have been waiting a very long time to meet you properly, Caroline Ravencrest." The way he spoke her name sent shivers down her spine, not from fear, but from recognition. It was as if he had been saying her name for years, as if it belonged on his lips in a way that felt both foreign and completely natural. "Waiting?" Caroline's voice was barely audible. "But I have never seen you before tonight." A smile curved Luka's lips, revealing teeth that were perhaps a shade too sharp to be entirely human. "You have lived in this castle all your life, have you not? Walked these gardens countless times, felt eyes upon you in the darkness, sensed a presence watching from the shadows." His crimson gaze held hers, and she found herself unable to look away. "I have been here, Caroline. Always here, waiting for the right moment to reveal myself." The pendant at her throat pulsed with warmth again, and Caroline's hand rose involuntarily to touch the stone. The moment her fingers made contact with the bloodstone, it began to glow with a deep red light that seemed to echo the color of Luka's eyes. "The pendant recognizes me," Luka said softly, his gaze shifting to the glowing stone. "As it should. It belonged to your ancestor, Lady Morgana Ravencrest, who was quite dear to me once upon a time." "That's impossible," Caroline breathed, though even as she spoke the words, she felt their falsehood in her bones. "That pendant is over 300 years old. No one could have known 327 years, to be precise." Luka interrupted, moving closer still until he stood directly before her bench. "I remember the night she gave it to you, asking me to watch over her bloodline should the need ever arise." The impossible nature of his words should have sent Caroline running, screaming for guards and protection. Instead, she found herself leaning forward, drawn by the certainty in his voice and the way the pendant continued to glow in response to his presence. "What are you?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "I am what your kind calls a vampire," Luka replied, without hesitation or shame. "A prince of the old blood, exiled from my homeland for crimes I did not commit, betrayed by those I trusted most." His expression darkened with memories of ancient pain. "For 3 centuries I have wandered, alone and purposeless, until tonight." Caroline stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was telling her. Vampires were creatures of legend, stories told to frighten children and entertain adults around winter fires. Yet, as she looked at Luka, at his impossible beauty, his otherworldly stillness, the way shadows seemed to bend around him, she could not deny the truth of what she was seeing. "Why tonight?" she whispered. "Why reveal yourself now?" Luka's expression softened, and for the first time since he had appeared, Caroline saw something vulnerable in those crimson eyes. "Because tonight you learned what I learned 3 centuries ago, that those who should value you most are often the first to cast you aside. Because tonight you discovered that loyalty and love mean nothing to those who see only immediate advantage." He extended one pale hand toward her. "Because tonight you are finally free to choose your own destiny." The pendant's glow intensified, bathing both of them in its warm red light. Caroline felt something shifting inside her, some part of her soul that had been sleeping beginning to stir to life. Looking at Luka, she saw not a monster from nightmares, but a kindred spirit, someone who understood betrayal and loneliness, someone who had waited centuries for this moment, just as she had waited 19 years to feel wanted again. "What are you offering me?" she asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "Everything Edmund denied you," Luka replied, his voice soft as velvet and strong as steel. "A partnership of equals, a love that transcends time and mortality, a chance to become more than society expects of a woman your age." His hand remained extended, waiting for her choice. "I offer you eternity, Caroline, and the power to ensure that no one ever dismisses you again." Caroline looked at his outstretched hand, then back at his face. In those ancient eyes, she saw patience and understanding, desire and respect. She saw everything she had hoped to find with Edmund, and so much more. The pendant at her throat pulsed once more, as if encouraging her to trust what her heart was telling her. For the first time in 19 years, Caroline felt truly seen. Caroline did not take Luka's hand that night. Though every fibre of her being seemed drawn to this mysterious figure who spoke of eternity and understanding, 3 decades of careful living could not be overturned in a single moment, no matter how extraordinary. Instead, she rose from the marble bench, her legs unsteady beneath her, and stepped back into the shadows of the ancient oaks. "I need time," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of confusion and wonder in equal measure. "This is beyond anything I ever imagined possible." Luka lowered his extended hand without disappointment, his expression holding the patience of someone who had learned to measure time in centuries rather than heartbeats. "Time is the one thing I have in abundance, Caroline. I have waited this long, I can wait longer if needed." He melted back into the darkness as silently as he had emerged, leaving Caroline alone with the fountain's gentle murmur and the warm glow of her pendant, which continued to pulse against her skin like a second heartbeat. She stood in the moonlit garden long after he had vanished, one hand pressed to the bloodstone at her throat, trying to convince herself that the encounter had been nothing more than a dream born from shock and humiliation. But the warmth of the pendant and the lingering scent of winter storms and old books that had surrounded Luka told her otherwise. Whatever had just occurred in her garden was as real as her broken heart and shattered dreams. The walk back to her chambers felt like traversing a foreign country. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more significant, every familiar corridor transformed by the knowledge that supernatural forces had been moving through her ancestral home for longer than she had been alive. Helena waited in her sitting room, pacing before the fireplace, with the agitated energy of a woman who had spent her life protecting her mistress and had just witnessed the most spectacular failure of that protection. "My lady!" Helena rushed forward as Caroline entered, her weathered hands reaching to steady her mistress's trembling form. "That display in the hall, the cruelty of it, I should have warned you. I should have seen the signs." Caroline allowed herself to be guided to the chair by the fire, grateful for the warmth and the familiar comfort of Helena's presence. The older woman had been more than a servant. She had been confidant, protector, and sometimes the closest thing to family Caroline possessed. If anyone deserved to know about the strange encounter in the garden, it was Helena. "There was no way you could have predicted Edmund's betrayal," Caroline said softly, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "I chose to trust him, despite the warning signs. I chose to believe that a man might value character over youth, wisdom over beauty." Helena knelt beside Caroline's chair, her grey eyes filled with a fierce loyalty that had never wavered through all the years of service. "You are worth a dozen of that shallow boy, my lady. Any man who cannot see your true value is blind and foolish." The silver mirror mounted above the mantelpiece caught the firelight and reflected Caroline's image back to her face, pale from shock, eyes red from tears, the burgundy gown that had been chosen with such hope, now a symbol of her humiliation. But as she looked at herself, something strange happened. The reflection seemed to shimmer, and for just a moment Caroline saw herself as Luka. Must have seen her not as a fading beauty past her prime, but as a woman of strength and dignity, someone whose worth had nothing to do with the number of years she had lived. "Helena," Caroline said slowly, her voice thoughtful, "do you believe in the old stories? The legends our grandmothers used to tell about creatures that lived in the shadows between worlds?" Helena's hands stilled in their gentle ministrations, and her eyes sharpened with an alertness that spoke of knowledge carefully hidden. "Why do you ask, my lady?" "Because I think I may have met one tonight." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Helena rose slowly, moving to the window that overlooked the gardens where Caroline had just stood. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman grappling with decisions that had been years in the making. "The Ravencrest bloodline has always been touched by mystery," Helena said finally, her voice careful and measured. "Your mother, Lady Evangeline, she knew things, saw things. The pendant you wear, she told me, it was more than mere jewelry." Caroline's hand moved instinctively to the bloodstone, which had finally stopped glowing but remained warm against her skin. "What did she tell you?" "That it would recognize its own, that when the time came, you would understand its true purpose." Helena turned from the window, her expression grave. "She made me promise to watch over you, to help you when that time arrived. I have been waiting 30 years for this conversation, my lady." The revelations were coming too quickly for Caroline to process. First, Luka and his impossible claims. Now Helena, suggesting that her own family had been touched by supernatural forces for generations. The woman she thought she knew, the life she thought she understood, were proving to be far more complex than she had ever imagined. "Tell me about my mother's death," Caroline said, though part of her feared the answer. Helena's face darkened with old grief and older anger. "The official reports said fever, but Lady Evangeline was the healthiest woman I ever knew, strong as an ox, sharp as a blade. She died 3 days after receiving a visit from a man who claimed to represent certain noble families concerned about unnatural influences in the kingdom." The implications hit Caroline like a physical blow. "You think she was murdered?" "I think she knew something was coming and chose to face it alone rather than put you at risk." Helena moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. She spoke of old bloodlines and ancient agreements, of promises made by ancestors to protect those who walked in darkness. "She told me that someday you might have to choose between the safe path and the path of power." Caroline's mind reeled as pieces of a puzzle she had not known existed began to fit together. Luka's words about her ancestor Lady Morgana, the pendant's recognition of his presence, her mother's mysterious death, it all pointed toward a destiny she had never suspected. "What do you know about Lord Luka?" she asked, though she was not entirely surprised when Helena nodded in recognition of the name. "I know he has walked these halls for longer than either of us has been alive. I know the shadows bend to his will, and that he sees truth where others see only surface appearances." Helena knelt beside Caroline's chair once more. "I also know that he has never shown interest in any woman until tonight." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room, as Caroline contemplated the impossible turns her life had taken in the span of a single evening. From betrayed bride to the object of a vampire prince's attention, it was the stuff of fairy tales and nightmares in equal measure. "He offered me eternity," Caroline whispered, speaking the words aloud for the first time. Helena's eyes widened, but not with surprise, with something that looked almost like relief. "And what did you tell him?" "That I needed time to think." Caroline met her faithful servant's gaze. "What would you counsel me to do?" Helena was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands clasped in her lap, her expression thoughtful. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of devotion and wisdom. "I would counsel you to choose with your heart, my lady. You have spent too many years making decisions based on what others expected of you. Tonight, for the first time in your life, you have the chance to choose based on what you want for yourself. Dawn broke over Castle Ravencrest with the pale light of early autumn, filtering through the tall windows of Caroline's chamber like a gentle benediction. She had not slept. How could she, when every time she closed her eyes, she saw crimson flames and felt the weight of an impossible choice pressing down upon her soul? Instead, she had spent the hours before sunrise, walking the length of her chamber, her bare feet silent against the worn stone floors, her mind turning over every word Luka had spoken in the moonlit garden. Helena had remained with her through the long night, offering silent support and occasional cups of chamomile tea that Caroline barely touched. As the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern wall in shades of gold and rose, Caroline finally stopped her restless pacing and moved to the window that overlooked the gardens where her life had changed forever. "I have made my decision," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was contemplating. Helena rose from her chair by the dying fire, her expression carefully neutral. "And what have you decided, my lady?" Caroline turned from the window, and Helena drew in a sharp breath at what she saw. Gone was the broken woman who had fled the great hall in tears. Gone was the uncertain soul who had spent the night wrestling with impossible choices. In their place stood a woman transformed by resolution, her green eyes bright with purpose, her bearing regal despite her simple nightgown. "I have decided that I am tired of being a victim of other people's choices," Caroline said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I am tired of measuring my worth by standards set by those who see women as possessions to be traded for political advantage. I am tired of being dismissed and overlooked and cast aside." She moved to her dressing table, where the bloodstone pendant lay coiled like a sleeping serpent. The moment her fingers touched the ancient stone, it began to glow with that deep, warm light that had marked Luka's presence. "If Lord Luka truly offers partnership and respect, if he sees value in what I am, rather than mourning what I no longer possess, then I will accept his proposal." Caroline lifted the pendant, watching the way the light seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. "I will become whatever I need to become to ensure that no one ever has the power to humiliate me again." Helena's weathered face broke into a smile that mixed pride with something that might have been relief. "Your mother would be proud, my lady. She always said the Ravencrest women were meant for extraordinary things." As if summoned by Caroline's decision, a crimson rose appeared on her windowsill, a flower so deep red it was nearly black, its petals perfect, despite the autumn chill that should have killed any growing thing. Caroline approached it slowly, marveling at its impossible beauty and the way it seemed to radiate warmth like a living jewel. "From Lord Luka?" Helena asked, though they both knew the answer. Caroline nodded, lifting the rose carefully. Its stem bore no thorns, and as her fingers closed around it, she felt a surge of something that might have been magic or might have been hope. Perhaps they were the same thing. A folded piece of parchment had been tucked beneath the flower, and with trembling fingers, Caroline unfolded what proved to be a letter written in an elegant hand that seemed to flow like spilled ink across the cream-colored paper. Asterisk, "My dearest Caroline, asterisk, asterisk. This rose will never wilt, just as my regard for you will never fade. It blooms eternal, sustained by forces beyond the understanding of mortal gardeners, much as our bond transcends the limitations that others would place upon it. Asterisk, asterisk. I do not ask for your answer lightly, nor do I offer transformation without understanding the weight of what I propose. To accept my hand is to leave behind the world you have known and step into realms where different laws apply, where power flows according to older truths than those recognized by kings and courts. Asterisk, asterisk. But know this, in all my centuries of existence, through all the beauty I have witnessed and the wonders I have seen, nothing has moved me as deeply as watching you stand with dignity intact despite your pain. You possess a strength that has nothing to do with youth and everything to do with character. You carry within you a grace that time cannot touch and cruelties cannot diminish. Asterisk, asterisk. If you choose to accept my proposal, meet me in the rose garden at midnight. Come alone, but come without fear. I swear by the ancient laws that bind my kind that no harm will come to you by my hand or by my will. Asterisk, asterisk. If you choose to refuse, I will respect your decision and trouble you no more. The rose will remain as a token of what might have been, and I will carry the memory of your courage into whatever lonely centuries await me. Asterisk, asterisk. Either way, know that you have reminded me what it means to hope. Asterisk, asterisk. With deepest admiration, Luka times Caroline read the letter twice, her heart racing with each carefully chosen word. Here was no flowery poetry or empty flattery, but honest emotion expressed with the weight of centuries behind it. Luka wrote to her as an equal, acknowledging the magnitude of his offer while respecting her right to refuse. It was everything Edmund's casual dismissal had not been: thoughtful, respectful, genuine. He writes like a man who understands the value of words, Helena observed, having read the letter over Caroline's shoulder. He writes like a man who has had centuries to learn the difference between hollow promises and true intent, Caroline replied, carefully refolding the parchment. Look how he acknowledges the risks, the challenges, the weight of what he offers. No pretty lies about how simple it will be or how love conquers all. She moved to her wardrobe, her movements decisive now that her path was clear. Help me prepare for tonight, Helena. I want to look like a woman worthy of eternity, not like a cast-off bride seeking comfort in desperate measures. Helena nodded, her hands already reaching for the deep emerald gown that brought out the fire in Caroline's eyes and complemented the auburn of her hair. As they worked together to transform Caroline from heartbroken woman to potential vampire queen, the older servant shared stories she had kept hidden for decades, tales of Lady Evangeline's strange visitors, of whispered conversations about old agreements and ancient protections, of a family legacy that went far beyond noble titles and ancestral lands. Your great-great-grandmother, Lady Morgana, was said to be the most beautiful woman of her generation, Helena said as she arranged Caroline's hair in an elaborate style that emphasized her elegant neck. But beauty fades, my lady, character endures, and the Ravencrest character has always been marked by courage in the face of impossible choices. As the day progressed, word reached them that Edmund and Isabel's hasty wedding ceremony had concluded before dawn, with only a handful of witnesses present. The haste spoke of political necessity rather than romantic passion. Lord Blackwood's armies were needed immediately to put down rebellions in the eastern provinces, and the alliance could not wait for proper ceremonies or celebrations. The news should have hurt, Caroline realized, but instead she felt only a distant sort of pity for a man who would trade genuine affection for temporary political advantage. Let him discover what he had gained and lost when the immediate crisis passed, and he found himself bound to a girl who had married his title rather than his heart. By evening, Caroline was ready. The emerald gown hugged her figure perfectly. The bloodstone pendant gleamed against her throat, and the crimson rose was tucked into her hair like a promise of things to come. She looked at herself in the silver mirror and saw not a woman past her prime, but a woman coming into her power. "Are you certain, my lady?" Helena asked one final time. Caroline smiled, and for the first time in years, the expression held no shadows of doubt or self-recrimination. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Midnight approached with the inevitability of destiny itself. Caroline made her way through the castle's corridors with purpose rather than hesitation, her emerald gown whispering against the ancient stones like secrets shared between old friends. The rose garden lay beyond the main courtyard, through an archway carved with symbols that had always seemed merely decorative, but now pulsed with significance she was only beginning to understand. The garden itself was a masterpiece of medieval design, with carefully tended beds arranged in intricate patterns around a central fountain where stone angels poured eternal water from carved urns. Moonlight transformed the space into something otherworldly, casting long shadows between the carefully pruned bushes and turning the gravel paths into rivers of silver. Caroline had walked these paths countless times during her years at Ravencrest, but tonight they led somewhere entirely new. Luka was waiting beside the fountain, no longer concealed by shadows, but standing openly in the moonlight like a figure from an illuminated manuscript. He wore midnight blue, so dark it seemed to absorb light, and his pale skin seemed to glow with an inner radiance that had nothing to do with the moon overhead. When he saw Caroline approaching, his crimson eyes lit with something that transcended mere satisfaction. It was recognition, the acknowledgement of a choice that would reshape both their destinies. "You came," he said softly, his voice carrying the wonder of someone who had hoped, but not quite dared to believe. "I came," Caroline confirmed, stopping just beyond arm's reach, close enough to see the fine details of his otherworldly features, but maintaining the dignity of space between them. "I have read your letter, considered your offer, and made my choice." Luka inclined his head with the respect due to someone making a decision that would echo through eternity. "And what have you decided, Caroline Ravencrest?" "I have decided that I am tired of living according to other people's definitions of what my life should be." Caroline's voice grew stronger with each word, carrying the conviction of someone who had found her true north after years of wandering. "I have decided that if you truly offer partnership, respect, and the chance to become more than society expects of a woman my age, then I accept your proposal." The ancient binding scroll materialized in Luka's hands, as if summoned by her words, a parchment that seemed far older than the castle itself, covered in writing that shifted between languages as Caroline watched. Some words appeared to be Latin, others in scripts she did not recognize, but all of them pulsed with the same deep red light as her bloodstone pendant. "This scroll contains the vampire marriage rites," Luka explained, his voice taking on a formal cadence that spoke of ceremonies older than kingdoms. Words written in the blood of vampire royalty, binding not just for a lifetime, but for all eternity. Once spoken, these vows cannot be broken by death, time, or any power known to mortal or immortal kind. Caroline studied the ancient parchment, noting how the words seemed to dance and shift in the moonlight. "What does it require of me?" "Complete trust," Luka replied without hesitation. "The ritual will bind your soul to mine, grant you immortality and power beyond anything you have known, but it also means leaving your mortal life behind forever. You will be vampire royalty, Caroline, with all the responsibilities and dangers that entails." "And what does it require of you?" Luka's expression softened, revealing something vulnerable beneath his supernatural composure. "Everything I am, everything I have been, everything I will ever become. The binding makes us equals in every sense, partners in power, companions in eternity. Neither of us will hold dominion over the other." Caroline nodded slowly, understanding that what he offered was not just transformation, but true partnership of a kind she had never experienced. Edmund had wanted a wife to manage his household and bear his children. Luka was offering her queenship of a realm she was only beginning to comprehend. "There is something else you should know," Luka continued, his voice growing heavy with centuries of pain. "The court that so casually discarded you tonight, many of those families have been vampire hunters for generations. They kill my kind without trial or mercy, believing themselves righteous in their hatred. To accept my hand is to place yourself in their crosshairs." "Then we are well matched," Caroline replied with a smile that held no warmth for those who had betrayed her. "They have already proven they see me as disposable. At least with you, I will have the power to ensure they never underestimate me again." The scroll began to glow more brightly as Caroline reached for it, her fingers tingling as they made contact with the ancient parchment. The moment she touched it, words began to flow from her lips, not words she had learned or memorized, but ancient vows that seemed to rise from some deep part of her soul that had been waiting for this moment. By blood and moonlight, by choice freely made, Caroline spoke, her voice carrying across the garden with supernatural resonance. I bind my soul to yours, Luka of the ancient line, prince of the shadow realm. Let our lives become one life, our power, shared power, our love, eternal love. Luka's response came immediately, his voice blending with hers in harmonies that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the castle. By blood and moonlight, by choice freely made, I bind my soul to yours, Caroline of the noble heart, queen of my eternal realm. Let our lives become one life, our power, shared power, our love, eternal love. The scroll burst into crimson flame that did not burn, rising into the night air like a prayer made visible. Where the parchment had been, a crown materialized, not gold or silver, but something that seemed to be woven from moonlight itself, delicate as spun glass, yet radiating power that made the air shimmer around it. The crown of vampire royalty, Luka whispered, his eyes wide with wonder. I have not seen its like for 3 centuries. It appears only when the ancient bloodlines recognize a true queen. He lifted the ethereal crown with reverent hands, and Caroline felt herself changing even before it touched her head. Her senses sharpened until she could hear the heartbeat of every creature in the garden, smell the approaching dawn hours away, see details in the darkness that human eyes could never perceive. Strength flowed through her limbs like liquid fire, and she understood that she would never again be vulnerable to the casual cruelties of those who measured worth in years rather than character. As the crown settled onto her auburn hair, Caroline felt the final transformation take hold. She was no longer the discarded bride who had fled the great hall in tears. She was no longer the aging widow, desperate for companionship. She was Caroline Ravencrest, vampire queen, partner to a prince who had chosen her for her strength rather than her youth, her wisdom rather than her beauty. How do you feel? Luka asked softly, his crimson eyes studying her face with loving concern. Caroline smiled, and for the first time in her life, the expression held no shadows of doubt or fear. I feel like myself. The transformation was not complete with the crown's blessing, it was only the beginning. As Caroline and Luka stood together in the rose garden, the ethereal crown upon her head pulsing with otherworldly light, she felt the ancient magic working through her very being. Her human mortality was not stripped away violently, but dissolved gently, like morning mist before the sun, replaced by something infinitely more powerful and enduring. The process will continue through the night, Luka explained, his hand steady and warm in hers, despite his supernatural nature. Your body must adapt to immortality gradually, or the shock would destroy your human mind. By dawn, the transformation will be complete, but until then, you may experience moments of disorientation. Caroline nodded, marveling at how her enhanced senses allowed her to perceive layers of meaning in his words that she would have missed as a mortal. She could hear the genuine concern beneath his explanation, smell the faint scent of ancient magic that surrounded them both, feel the pull of supernatural bonds settling into place like chains forged from starlight. "Will you stay with me through it?" she asked. Not from fear, but from a desire to share this momentous experience with the man who had chosen to make her his equal. "For as long as you wish," Luka replied, bringing her hand to his lips in a gesture that belonged to courtly tradition, yet felt entirely new when performed by someone whose kiss carried the weight of eternity. "We are bound now, Caroline. Your joys are my joys, your fears my fears, your pain my pain. I will never leave you to face anything alone again." They walked deeper into the garden, past beds of flowers that seemed more vibrant now that Caroline could perceive them with supernatural clarity. Colors that had always seemed muted revealed hidden depths. Fragrances carried messages she was only beginning to decipher, and the very air hummed with energies that mortal senses could never detect. It was as if she had spent her entire life looking at the world through clouded glass and suddenly been given perfect vision. "Tell me about your exile," Caroline said, as they settled on a marble bench beneath an arbor of climbing roses. "You mentioned betrayal. What happened 3 centuries ago?" Luka's expression grew distant, his crimson eyes reflecting memories of ancient pain. "I ruled the northern kingdoms alongside my brothers, maintaining peace between the vampire courts and the mortal realms. We had agreements, treaties written in blood and sealed with sacred oaths. Humans lived their lives, and we lived ours, with only minimal interaction." He paused, his jaw tightening with old anger. "But some humans could not accept that supernatural beings deserved the same right to exist that they claimed for themselves. They formed secret societies, calling themselves hunters, dedicated to destroying every vampire, werewolf, and magical creature they could find. When they began targeting innocents, vampires who had never harmed a human soul, I intervened." Caroline felt his pain as if it were her own, the supernatural bond between them, carrying emotions as clearly as words. "What did you do?" "I protected them," Luka said simply. "I used my position and power to shield vampire families from the hunters' persecution. But my own court saw this as weakness, as placing vampire lives above political expediency. When the hunters demanded a sacrifice to prove the vampires' good faith, my brothers chose me. The betrayal cut deep, even after 3 centuries, and Caroline understood why he had been drawn to her own experience of abandonment. They were kindred spirits in the truest sense, both cast aside by those who should have valued them most, both learning that loyalty was often a one-way proposition among the powerful. "They exiled you to save themselves," Caroline said, her voice heavy with empathy. "They stripped me of my titles, my lands, my armies, and cast me out into the mortal world with nothing but the clothes on my back." Luka's hand tightened around hers. "For 3 centuries I wandered, watching from the shadows as the hunter families grew stronger and more organized. I watched them infiltrate human nobility, marry into royal bloodlines, position themselves to strike when the time was right." Caroline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "The families at court tonight, some of them are hunters?" "More than some," Luka confirmed grimly. "Lord Edmund's family has been hunting vampires for 5 generations. Lady Isabel's father commands a network of hunter cells across the northern territories. The very nobles who dismissed you tonight as worthless would kill you without hesitation if they knew what you have become." The irony was not lost on Caroline. The same people who had considered her disposable as a human would see her as a mortal threat now that she possessed real power. But instead of fear, she felt something closer to anticipation. Let them try to dismiss her now. Let them attempt to cast her aside or treat her as inconsequential. They would learn the hard way that some women grew more dangerous with age, not less. "Do they suspect what you are?" Caroline asked. "They sense something," Luka admitted. "My presence makes them uncomfortable in ways they cannot quite explain. But they believe all the old vampire bloodlines were destroyed centuries ago. They think they hunted us to extinction." Caroline smiled, and there was something distinctly predatory in the expression, a glimpse of the vampire queen she was becoming. "Then tomorrow should prove quite educational for them." "Tomorrow?" Luka raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the steel in her voice. "Tomorrow we return to the Great Hall," Caroline said, her voice growing stronger as the transformation continued its work through her system. "We announce our marriage to the very court that humiliated me, and we watch their faces when they realize what they are truly dealing with." "That is extremely dangerous," Luka warned, though his tone carried admiration rather than disapproval. "Once they know what we are, they will mobilize every hunter family in the kingdom against us." "Good," Caroline replied without hesitation. I am tired of hiding, tired of being dismissed, tired of allowing small-minded people to dictate the terms of my existence. If they want a war, they can have one. But this time, they will be fighting someone who cannot be intimidated or cast aside. The moonstone crown pulsed brighter on her head, responding to her growing confidence and determination. Luka studied her face in its ethereal light, seeing the transformation that went far deeper than supernatural enhancement. Caroline was not just becoming a vampire, she was becoming the queen she had always been meant to be. "You realize," he said softly, "that there is no going back once we reveal ourselves. Win or lose, your old life ends tomorrow night." Caroline looked at him with eyes that now held flecks of the same crimson fire that burned in his own. "My old life ended the moment Edmund chose that child over me. Tomorrow, I begin living the life I should have claimed decades ago." Dawn broke over Castle Ravencrest, with Caroline's transformation reaching its culmination. As the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose, she felt the last vestiges of her mortal existence slip away like a discarded cloak. Her vision sharpened to supernatural clarity, her hearing expanded to encompass sounds from miles away, and her strength settled into her bones like liquid steel. But it was the mental transformation that proved most remarkable. Memories that had been clouded suddenly blazed with crystal clarity, revealing truths that had been hidden for decades. "Something is wrong," Caroline said suddenly, her hand moving instinctively to the bloodstone pendant that now pulsed in perfect rhythm with her immortal heartbeat. "There are things I remember now that I should not remember. Conversations I was too young to understand. Visitors who came in the night when I was supposed to be sleeping." Luka turned from where he had been standing watch at the garden's edge, his expression immediately alert. "What kind of memories?" Caroline closed her eyes, allowing the enhanced recall of her vampire nature to sift through decades of buried experiences. "My mother meeting with strangers in the library after I had been sent to bed. Hushed conversations about bloodlines and ancient agreements. A man with scars on his hands telling her that the time was coming when choices would have to be made." She opened her eyes, and Luka saw something new burning in their depths, not just the crimson flames of vampire transformation, but the sharp light of revelation. "I was not chosen randomly, was I? This was always meant to happen." Before Luka could answer, a new presence made itself known in the garden. The prophecy stone materialized between them, floating in the air like a captured star, its crystalline surface swirling with images too complex for mortal minds to process, but perfectly clear to Caroline's enhanced perception. As she watched, the stone's depths revealed scenes from the past, present and future, all connected by threads of destiny that stretched back centuries. "The prophecy stone only appears when fate reaches a crucial turning point," Luka said softly, his voice heavy with the weight of recognition. "I have seen it only twice before in my existence, once when my brothers betrayed me, and once the night your ancestor Lady Morgana gave me the bloodstone pendant and made me swear an oath. I thought I understood." Caroline approached the floating stone with the fearless grace of someone who had already sacrificed everything for truth. As her fingers neared its surface, images began to flow faster, painting a story that recontextualized everything she thought she knew about her life. She saw Lady Morgana 3 centuries ago, heavily pregnant and desperate, fleeing through the very gardens where Caroline now stood. She saw vampire hunters closing in, led by a man whose face bore the unmistakable features of Edmund's bloodline. She saw Morgana's final sacrifice, allowing herself to be captured while ensuring her unborn child would escape to safety. "She was my ancestor," Caroline whispered, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. "Morgana was not just dear to you, she was carrying your child." Luka's face went ashen, his centuries of composure cracking as the implications crashed over him. "That's impossible. The child died with her. I saw the hunters burn them both. But the prophecy stone showed them the truth the vampire prince had never known. Morgana's child had been born in captivity, hidden away by a sympathetic guard who smuggled the baby to human family, willing to raise it as their own. That child had grown up never knowing their supernatural heritage, but carrying dormant vampire bloodline that would pass down through generations, weakening with each human marriage, but never disappearing entirely. "The bloodstone pendant," Caroline said, her voice hollow with shock. "She gave it to you not as a token of affection, but as a way to recognize her descendant when the bloodline was strong enough to manifest again." The stone's visions shifted, showing Caroline's mother's mysterious death in a new light. Lady Evangeline had not been killed because she knew about supernatural forces. She had been murdered because she was preparing to awaken Caroline's dormant vampire heritage. The Hunter families had discovered the truth about the Ravencrest bloodline and acted quickly to prevent another vampire from gaining power. "They killed my mother to keep me from learning what I was," Caroline said, her voice growing cold with a fury that made the air around them shimmer with supernatural energy. "They murdered her, then spent decades positioning themselves to control my life, ensuring I would never pose a threat to them." Luka stared at Caroline with eyes wide with wonder and pain. "You are not just my chosen queen, Caroline. You are my descendant. The child I thought I had lost centuries ago lived, and their bloodline led to you." The revelation should have horrified them, both the thought that their marriage bond connected them across generations of bloodline. But vampire lore was older and more complex than human taboos, and the prophecy stone revealed that this connection was not accident, but destiny. The ancient magic that governed their kind had orchestrated events to restore a bloodline that had been stolen, to right a wrong that had festered for 3 centuries. Edmund's betrayal was not random cruelty, Caroline realized, the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. His family knew what I was. They knew that my reaching marriageable age again would eventually lead to this moment. They arranged the engagement to keep me close, to monitor me. And when they realized I was beginning to awaken, they had to act quickly. "The Hunter families have been preparing for this," Luka said grimly. "They knew that eventually the old bloodlines would resurface. They have spent centuries positioning themselves throughout human nobility, intermarrying with royal houses, building networks that span kingdoms." The prophecy stone pulsed brighter, showing them images of the present moment. Throughout the castle, Hunter families were already mobilizing. Secret chambers were being opened. Ancient weapons blessed with silver and holy water were being distributed, and messages were being sent to Hunter cells across the continent. The revelation of Caroline's transformation had not gone unnoticed. Supernatural forces that sensitive could feel the shift in the magical balance of the world. "They know," Caroline said, her enhanced senses detecting the subtle changes in the castle's atmosphere. "They can feel what I have become, and they are preparing to strike." "We could flee," Luka offered, though his tone suggested he knew she would refuse. "Leave tonight, before they can organize their forces. Build our strength elsewhere. Return when we are better prepared." Caroline's smile held no warmth for those who had orchestrated her mother's death and manipulated her entire life. "Run from the people who murdered my mother? Hide from the families who treated me like a pawn in their ancient war?" She shook her head. "No, my love. They wanted to control the awakening of the Ravencrest bloodline. Let them see what they have actually awakened." The prophecy stone's final vision showed them what lay ahead, a confrontation that would determine not just their fate, but the future balance between the supernatural and mortal worlds. The Hunter families had grown too powerful, too confident in their ability to exterminate anything that threatened their vision of human supremacy. They had forgotten that some forces could not be destroyed, only delayed. "You realize," Luka said softly, "that if we face them tonight, we face them alone. My brothers stripped me of my armies, my allies, my resources. It will be just the 2 of us, against centuries of preparation and organization." Caroline looked at him with eyes that burned with the fire of ancient bloodlines and newfound purpose. Just the two of us? Luka, I am the heir to 3 centuries of suppressed power, the descendant of a vampire prince and a noble line that has endured every attempt to destroy it. You are an exiled prince with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. She smiled, and there was something beautiful and terrible in the expression. I think they should be afraid of us, not the other way around. As if responding to her words, the prophecy stone flared with light so bright it outshone the rising sun, then dissolved into sparks that settled around them like blessings from ancient gods. The transformation was complete. Caroline was no longer becoming a vampire queen. She was one, and she was ready to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her bloodline. Tonight, she said, her voice carrying the authority of born royalty and earned power, we end this war they started 3 centuries ago. The ancient weapon appeared at sunset, thrust through the oak doors of Caroline's chamber like a challenge carved from silver and malice. The hunter's silver blade was a masterpiece of supernatural warfare, its metal blessed by generations of priests, its edge honed to cut through vampire flesh as easily as morning mist, its crossguard inscribed with symbols that caused pain to any supernatural creature who looked upon them too long. Helena found it first, pinned to the door with a parchment that bore the seal of united hunter families. "My lady," Helena called, her voice tight with fear and fury as she held the message at arm's length. "They have sent their declaration." Caroline took the parchment with hands that no longer trembled, her vampire nature allowing her to read the sacred symbols without flinching. The message was brief and brutal in its simplicity. Asterisk, come to the Great Hall at midnight, face judgment for the crime of existing. Refuse, and we will hunt you across continents and centuries until every trace of your corrupted bloodline is erased from existence. Asterisk, how many of them? Caroline asked, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had found her true power. Helena's expression was grim. 20 families represented at court, each with trained hunters among their retinues. Perhaps 60 fighters, all armed with blessed weapons and centuries of experience killing supernatural creatures. 60, Caroline mused, setting the message aside with the casual disregard it deserved. They bring 60 hunters to face 2 vampires. Either they vastly overestimate us, or we have vastly underestimated ourselves. Luka entered the chamber with the silent grace that marked his supernatural nature, his expression darkening as he sensed the weapon's presence. The silver blade caused him physical discomfort, its blessed metal radiating energies designed to cause pain to his kind, but he approached it without hesitation. "I recognize the craftsmanship," he said, studying the weapon with the eye of someone who had faced such tools before. "This blade has killed at least a dozen vampires. Its silver is stained with our blood, blessed with our deaths. They send it as both threat and promise." Caroline moved to stand beside him, her enhanced senses allowing her to perceive the weapon's dark history without being overwhelmed by its supernatural aura. "Then we shall have to ensure it claims no more victims tonight." Caroline. Luka's voice carried 3 centuries of hard-won wisdom. "You must understand what we face. These are not ordinary humans, driven by ignorance or fear. They are trained killers who have dedicated their lives to destroying creatures far older and more powerful than you. Some have been hunting vampires since childhood. They know our weaknesses, our limitations, our traditional tactics, and what they do not know," Caroline replied with a smile that held no warmth for their enemies, "is that I am not a traditional vampire. I am something they have never faced before, a woman who has lived as prey for 54 years and finally gained the power to become a predator." Helena moved about the chamber with efficient purpose, gathering items that had belonged to the Ravencrest family for generations. a silver mirror that reflected truth, rather than mere appearance, candles that burned with light no darkness could extinguish, and a leather-bound journal filled with Lady Evangeline's careful notes about supernatural defenses and protective rituals. "Your mother prepared for this day," Helena said, opening the journal to pages marked with urgent annotations. She knew the Hunter families would eventually move against the bloodline. These writings detail every weakness they exploit, every tactic they employ, every advantage they believe they possess. Caroline studied her mother's careful script, feeling a connection across the years to the woman who had died, protecting secrets Caroline was only now beginning to understand. The journal contained not just defensive strategies, but offensive techniques, ways to turn Hunter tactics against themselves, methods for exploiting the very faith and righteousness that powered their blessed weapons. She was preparing to awaken my vampire heritage, Caroline realized, reading between the lines of protective rituals and blood ceremonies. The notes become more urgent in the weeks before her death. She knew they were closing in, but she was trying to complete the awakening before they could stop her. "Which means," Luka said slowly, understanding dawning in his crimson eyes, "that you possess knowledge they believe died with her. They think they eliminated the threat by killing Lady Evangeline, but she passed her research to you through blood memory and careful preparation." As night deepened over Castle Ravencrest, Caroline found herself experiencing a strange calm that had nothing to do with supernatural enhancement and everything to do with finally understanding her purpose. For 54 years, she had lived according to other people's expectations, measuring her worth by their standards, accepting their judgment of her value. Tonight, she would show them the price of dismissing what they did not understand. "There is something else," Helena said hesitantly, producing a small vial filled with liquid that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Your mother's final experiment. She called it the equalizer, a substance that would temporarily strip blessed weapons of their supernatural properties." Caroline took the vial, feeling the weight of her mother's desperation and determination in the cool glass. "How much is needed? A single drop on each weapon renders it powerless for an hour, but getting close enough to apply it." Helena's expression showed the obvious problem with the strategy. "Getting close enough is exactly what I intend to do," Caroline said, tucking the vial into the folds of her gown. "They expect us to fight from a distance, to rely on supernatural speed and strength. They do not expect a vampire queen to walk directly into their midst and face them as equals." Luka studied her face, seeing something in her expression that filled him with equal measures of pride and concern. "You have a plan." "I have several plans," Caroline corrected, moving to the window that overlooked the great hall's towering windows. "The first involves reminding them that this is my ancestral home, and I know every secret passage, every hidden chamber, every defensive advantage built into these stones over 3 centuries. She turned back to them, her bearing regal, despite the simple gown she wore. "The second involves the fact that they are so focused on ancient grudges and supernatural threats that they have forgotten the most basic rule of warfare. Never underestimate your enemy's willingness to sacrifice everything for victory." "And the third?" Luka asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Caroline's smile was beautiful and terrible and absolutely without mercy. "The third involves showing them that some women become more dangerous with age, not less. They want to judge me for the crime of existing? Very well. Tonight, they learn what it means to exist as my enemy." As midnight approached, Caroline made her final preparations with the methodical care of someone who had spent a lifetime managing details and now applied that skill to warfare. She dismissed Helena to safety, knowing that her loyal servant had already done more than duty required by protecting Ravencrest secrets for 30 years. She studied her mother's journal one final time, committing every defensive ritual and offensive strategy to her enhanced vampire memory. And she stood before the silver mirror of truth, seeing herself not as others had defined her, but as she truly was, a queen preparing to reclaim her throne. "Are you ready?" Luka asked, offering her his arm with the courtesy due to an equal. Caroline took his arm, feeling the strength of their supernatural bond flow between them like liquid steel. "I have been ready for this my entire life, I just did not know it until tonight." Together, they walked from Caroline's chamber toward the great hall, where their enemies waited, their footsteps echoing through corridors that had sheltered the Ravencrest bloodline for 3 centuries. Behind them, the hunter's silver blade remained embedded in the oak door, a threat they had chosen to answer not with fear, but with the kind of righteous fury that could reshape kingdoms. The castle itself seemed to respond to their passage, shadows deepening to provide cover, stones warming under their feet as if the very foundations of Ravencrest recognized their rightful queen walking to battle. By the time they reached the great hall's massive doors, Caroline no longer felt like a woman going to face her executioners. She felt like a vampire queen arriving to pass judgment on those who had dared threaten her realm. The great hall of Castle Ravencrest had been transformed into an arena of judgment. The long tables where wedding guests had feasted just days before now formed a semicircle around the central space, their surfaces lined with an arsenal of blessed weapons that glinted with malevolent purpose in the candlelight. 60 hunters stood at attention, their faces masked by the righteous certainty of those who had never questioned their cause. At their head stood Lord Edmund, no longer the charming suitor, but revealed as the cold-eyed killer he had always been beneath his courtly facade. Caroline paused in the doorway, taking in the scene with the enhanced perception of her vampire nature. She could smell the fear beneath their bravado, hear the elevated heartbeats that betrayed their nervousness, see the way some of the younger hunters gripped their weapons too tightly. They had prepared for this moment for decades, but preparation was not the same as experience, and few among them had ever faced a vampire who walked willingly into their midst. "Lady Caroline Ravencrest," Edmund called out, his voice carrying across the vast hall with theatrical authority. "You stand accused of accepting corruption from the undead, of willingly transforming yourself into an abomination against the natural order. How do you answer these charges?" Caroline stepped forward with the fluid grace of her supernatural nature, Luka moving beside her like a shadow given form. As she walked, the shield of starlight began to manifest around her, not visible to human eyes, but a protective barrier woven from vampire magic and ancestral power that would turn aside the first wave of any attack. "I answer that you have no authority to judge me in my own ancestral home," Caroline replied, her voice carrying easily through the hall without effort or strain. "I answer that your charges hold no weight when spoken by murderers who killed my mother for the crime of protecting her bloodline." Murmurs rippled through the assembled hunters, some surprised by her composure, others angered by her defiance. But Caroline was not finished. "I answer that your presence here tonight proves what cowards you truly are," she continued, her green eyes now touched with crimson flames that made several hunters step back involuntarily. 60 armed men to face one woman and her husband. Tell me, Lord Edmund, is this the courage your family taught you? Is this the honor you represent? Edmund's face flushed with rage, but before he could respond, Caroline raised her hand, and something extraordinary happened. The shield of starlight expanded outward, becoming visible as a shimmering barrier of silver light that protected not just Caroline and Luka, but several servants who had remained in the hall despite the danger. "You see," Caroline said, her voice growing stronger as her power manifested, "you have misunderstood the nature of what I have become. You expected a monster driven by bloodlust, a creature that would validate your hatred and justify your violence. Instead, you face a queen who chooses protection over destruction, wisdom over wrath." The barrier pulsed with each word, and the hunters realized with growing alarm that their blessed weapons, while still potent, seemed somehow less certain in the face of magic that drew its power not from darkness, but from an ancient nobility they had forgotten existed. "She protects the innocent," whispered Lady Isabel, who stood near the back of the assembled hunters with her father, Lord Blackwood. "The servants, she's shielding them from us, not from her." This was not the behavior the hunters had expected from a vampire, and Caroline saw confusion beginning to crack their unified resolve. They had prepared to face a monster, but she stood before them as something far more dangerous, a leader with supernatural power guided by moral principle. "Your corruption runs deeper than we thought," Edmund snarled, drawing his silver sword with hands that trembled slightly. "You twist the very nature of your evil to appear righteous. But we will not be deceived by pretty words and protective displays." "No deception," Caroline replied calmly. "Only truth you are unwilling to see. You have spent so long defining yourselves as heroes in a war against monsters that you cannot recognize when you have become the monsters yourselves." She gestured toward the weapons arrayed against them, her enhanced senses detecting the dark history each blade carried. How many innocents have died on these blessed edges? How many supernatural creatures were killed, not for crimes committed, but simply for existing? How many families destroyed not out of justice, but out of fear? The shield of starlight began to expand further, its light growing brighter, and several of the younger hunters found themselves questioning everything they had been taught. This was not the soulless predator their elders had described. This was a woman of obvious intelligence and compassion, someone who used her power to protect rather than destroy. "Enough speeches," Lord Blackwood commanded, raising his own weapon. "We came here to end a threat, not to debate philosophy. The creature has revealed itself. Now we fulfill our sacred duty." But as the hunters prepared to attack, something in the hall's atmosphere shifted. The ancient stones of Castle Ravencrest began to resonate with power, responding to the presence of their rightful mistress as she finally claimed her heritage. Tapestries depicting centuries of Ravencrest nobility seemed to glow with approving light, and the very air grew thick with protective magic that made the hunters' movements sluggish. Caroline smiled, and there was something in the expression that made even the most experienced hunters hesitate. "You want to fulfill your sacred duty? Then face me as I truly am, not the broken woman you dismissed 3 days ago, but Caroline Ravencrest, Vampire Queen, heir to powers you cannot comprehend." The shield of starlight blazed with light that outshone every candle in the hall, and the first phase of the confrontation began. The attack came with the coordinated precision of decades of planning, but Caroline and Luka were no longer the isolated targets the hunters had expected to face. As blessed silver sang through the air toward them, something miraculous occurred in the heart of the great hall. The heart of eternity materialized between the vampire couple, a crystalline gem that pulsed with light so pure it made the hunter's weapons seem tarnished by comparison. Edmund's sword struck the gem's protective aura and rebounded with such force that he staggered backward, his blessed blade smoking where it had made contact with power that transcended mortal concepts of good and evil. Around the hall, other hunters found their weapons similarly affected, their centuries of preparation suddenly rendered inadequate against magic born from perfect love rather than ancient hatred. "Impossible," Lord Blackwood breathed, his own silver dagger clattering to the stone floor as the heart of eternity's radiance burned his hands without flame. "No vampire magic should be able to withstand consecrated weapons." Caroline stepped forward, the gem's light playing across her face and revealing the truth that the hunters had been too blinded by prejudice to see. "Your weapons are consecrated against evil, Lord Blackwood. But what stands before you tonight is not evil, it is love perfected, partnership absolute, two souls joined in bonds that your narrow understanding cannot comprehend." The heart of eternity pulsed brighter, and visions began to emanate from its crystalline depths. Images that filled the great hall with scenes of supernatural beings living in harmony with humans, of vampire courts that protected mortal settlements from darker threats, of the true history that hunter families had spent generations suppressing. "You see," Luka said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries as the visions played around them, "we were never your enemies. We were your guardians, maintaining balance between the seen and unseen worlds. Your ancestors twisted that truth, rewrote history to cast themselves as heroes, rather than acknowledge their role in destroying a peace that had endured for millennia." Lady Isabel broke away from her father's side, her young face pale with the shock of revelation. "The stories they told us about vampires as mindless killers, creatures without souls or conscience, they were lies." "Not lies," Caroline said gently, her enhanced empathy allowing her to feel the girl's genuine confusion and pain. "Distortions, truth stretched and twisted to serve a cause that had forgotten its original purpose. Some vampires did become monsters, just as some humans become killers. But we were judged as a species for the crimes of individuals." The Heart of Eternity's visions shifted, showing the hunters their own history with brutal clarity. They saw their ancestors' first encounters with supernatural beings, the negotiations and treaties that had kept peace, and the gradual corruption of purpose that had transformed protectors into persecutors. "Father," Isabel whispered, turning to Lord Blackwood with tears in her eyes, "how many innocents have we killed? How many creatures like Lady Caroline, who wanted only to exist in peace?" But the older hunters were too invested in their generational hatred to accept what they were seeing. Edmund rallied his forces with the desperation of someone whose entire worldview was crumbling. "Vampire tricks," he shouted, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Illusions meant to weaken our resolve. Do not let their magic deceive you." Yet as he spoke, the Heart of Eternity revealed one final, devastating truth. The real reason Edmund's family had arranged Caroline's engagement and subsequent humiliation. They had not simply been monitoring her bloodline, they had been systematically destroying it. Caroline's first husband had been murdered by hunter poison, not natural causes. Her years of isolation had been orchestrated to keep her from forming connections that might awaken her supernatural heritage. "You killed William," Caroline said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying through the hall like thunder. "You murdered my first husband because you feared what children of our bloodline might become." Edmund's face went ashen as the accusation hung in the air, confirmed by the Heart of Eternity's unforgiving light. Around the hall, even the most dedicated hunters began to look at their leaders with new understanding. This was not justice, it was genocide, conducted with methodical precision over generations. "We did what was necessary," Edmund said, but his words fell flat against the evidence of his family's crimes. "The vampire bloodlines had to be eliminated before they could threaten humanity again." "Whose humanity?" Caroline asked, stepping closer to him with each word. "The humanity that gave you the right to decide who lived and who died? The humanity that justified murdering an innocent man because of blood he carried unknowingly?" The shield of starlight merged with the Heart of Eternity's radiance, creating a barrier of pure protection that pushed the hunters back toward the hall's walls. But Caroline was not finished. She raised her hand, and the small vial of her mother's final creation appeared in her palm. "My mother's last gift," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. "A substance that strips blessed weapons of their power, but only when applied by choice, not force." She let the vial fall to the stone floor, where it shattered and released a fine mist that spread throughout the hall. Instantly, every blessed weapon lost its supernatural edge, becoming nothing more than ordinary silver and steel. "Now, we fight as equals," Caroline announced, her crimson eyes blazing with the fire of righteous justice. "No blessed weapons, no ancient advantages, no hiding behind claimed righteousness. Tonight, you face the consequences of your choices without the protection of prejudice. The Heart of Villian Eternity blazed one final time, sealing the magical conditions that would govern the final confrontation. When the light faded, vampire and hunter faced each other as they truly were supernatural beings and mortal humans, no longer separated by artificial advantages, ready to settle 3 centuries of injustice with truth as their only weapon. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Lady Caroline Ravencrest stood once again in the great hall of her ancestral castle. But the woman who surveyed the transformed space bore little resemblance to the broken bride who had once fled these same stones in tears. The vampire queen who ruled from the ancient throne wore her immortality like a crown, her auburn hair now touched with strands of silver starlight that caught the morning sun streaming through tall windows, her green eyes holding depths that spoke of wisdom earned through centuries of supernatural insight, compressed into months of extraordinary growth. The eternal wedding ring had appeared on her finger as the confrontation with the hunters reached its conclusion, not gold or silver, but a band that seemed to be woven from captured starlight and crystallized time itself. It was a physical manifestation of the bond between herself and Luka that transcended mortal concepts of marriage, a symbol of partnership that would endure through ages yet to come. The hall itself had been transformed from a place of judgment into a court of justice. Where hunter weapons had once gleamed with malevolent purpose, now hung tapestries depicting the true history of supernatural and human cooperation. The long tables that had hosted Edmund's cruel celebration now served as meeting spaces where representatives from both communities gathered to rebuild what centuries of hatred had destroyed. "Your Majesty," Helena said softly, approaching with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had watched her mistress grow from heartbroken woman to sovereign ruler, "the morning audiences are prepared to begin." Caroline smiled at her faithful companion, noting how the older woman moved with renewed vigor, now that the weight of keeping deadly secrets had been lifted from her shoulders. Helena had embraced her role as advisor to the vampire court with the same dedication she had once shown to protecting Ravencrest family mysteries, and her decades of experience with supernatural matters made her invaluable in the delicate work of rebuilding trust between species. "And our guests from the reformed hunter families?" Caroline asked, adjusting the simple but elegant gown that had replaced the elaborate court dress of her mortal years. She had discovered that true power needed no ornamental display. Her presence alone commanded respect in ways that jewelry and finery never could. "Lady Isabel and her delegation arrived this morning," Helena reported with obvious approval. "She brings word that 12 more hunter families have formally renounced their old practices and requested guidance in learning to distinguish between genuine supernatural threats and innocent beings seeking peaceful coexistence." The transformation had not been easy or universal. Some hunters, led by the remnants of Edmund's faction, had fled into exile rather than accept the new reality that supernatural beings deserved the same right to exist as any other living creatures. But their departure had allowed more reasonable voices to emerge, voices that had always questioned the wisdom of genocide, disguised as religious duty. Luka entered the hall with the quiet grace that marked his supernatural nature, but the centuries of loneliness that had once shadowed his features had been replaced by something Caroline had never dared hope to see: contentment. The vampire prince who had waited 300 years for this moment now moved through their shared domain with the confidence of someone whose patience had finally been rewarded beyond his wildest dreams. "The eastern provinces report complete success," he said, settling beside Caroline's throne with the easy intimacy of equal partners. "The werewolf clans have agreed to the mutual protection treaties, and the human settlements express gratitude for supernatural assistance in dealing with the bandits that had plagued their trade routes." Caroline nodded, feeling the satisfaction that came from seeing justice restore balance to a world that had been tilted toward hatred for too long. The supernatural community's emergence from centuries of hiding had not been without challenges, but the results proved what she had always believed, that cooperation produced better outcomes than conflict. "Any word from the capital?" she asked, though her tone suggested the answer held more curiosity than concern. "King's Council formally recognized our sovereignty yesterday," Luka replied, with a smile that held centuries of vindicated patience. Amazing how quickly political attitudes change when supernatural allies prove more effective than human armies at protecting trade routes and maintaining peace. A commotion at the hall's entrance announced the arrival of their first audience of the day. Edmund stumbled through the great doors, flanked by guards who treated him with the careful courtesy due to a defeated enemy rather than a prisoner. The man who had once commanded hunting parties across the kingdom now wore the haggard appearance of someone whose certainties had been stripped away, leaving only questions he lacked the courage to answer. "Lord Edmund," Caroline said formally, rising from her throne to address the man who had inadvertently set in motion the events that led to her true destiny. "You requested this audience. Speak." Edmund's eyes darted around the hall, taking in the evidence of everything he had failed to prevent or destroy. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the arrogant authority it had possessed just months before. "I came to ask for mercy," he said simply. "Not for myself, but for the families who followed my leadership in ignorance. They believed they were protecting humanity from supernatural threats. They trusted leaders who had lost sight of the difference between justice and vengeance." Caroline studied the broken man before her, feeling neither satisfaction nor anger at his defeat. Edmund had been a tool of forces larger than himself, shaped by generations of inherited hatred into something he might never have become if offered different choices. "Mercy is earned through actions, not words," Caroline replied. "You speak of protecting humanity. Prove that commitment. Use your knowledge of hunter networks to help us identify genuine supernatural threats while protecting innocent beings from persecution. Spend whatever years remain to you building rather than destroying." She gestured toward Lady Isabel, who stepped forward with the quiet dignity that had replaced her earlier uncertainty. "Lady Isabel has shown what redemption looks like. Follow her example, and mercy may indeed be possible." As Edmund was led away to begin the difficult work of undoing decades of damage, Caroline returned to her throne and felt the eternal wedding ring pulse with warmth against her finger. The band reminded her that some bonds transcended time, some love grew stronger with challenge, and some women discovered their true power only after the world had tried its best to convince them they were powerless. The broken bride who had once wept in these halls was gone forever. In her place sat a vampire queen who had learned that the strength earned from a lifetime of being overlooked could reshape kingdoms when finally unleashed